Hey, welcome to Watch Complications. I'm Brian. Hit that subscribe button, the bell if you want updates. Check me out on Instagram at watch_complications and check out my website, watchcomplications.com. I am double wristing today. It's what I'm calling the Battle of the Bronze. I have had a Christopher Ward C60 Bronze Ombré Trident for the past going on 3 years. And it was a limited edition of 300, the Mark II model. What they've done is they've recently released a Mark III. And what looks like very nearly the same watch on first glance is actually quite different. And I was kind of curious, if I had to choose between the two, the original Mark II and the new Mark III, which one would I choose? I decided to go ahead and grab one and then do a direct one-on-one comparison of these two watches. Let me just step back and say first that it's easy for a collector slash enthusiast to brush bronze off as, let's say, like a fad. It's not that interesting. Why would you want something that ages and looks more rugged, patinaed over time? And I was thinking that way, and I was in that camp for a long time. And there was nothing on the market that appealed to me. But in 2018, Christopher Ward released the Mark II Bronze Ombré, and it was like, wait, that's actually a good looking design. If there's ever a bronze I'm going to try, that's it. So I grabbed it, and my opinion has changed since. So don't knock it till you try it. If you haven't tried a bronze and you're a serious watch collector, at least give it a try. If it doesn't work out, fine. Sell it along, pass it along. But at least give it a try, because I think more people will probably change their mind about how they feel about it once they've had it. It's one of those things that once you have it and it's aging based on your wear, your environment, it becomes personal. It's your one-off watch. That thing belongs to you and it looks you. And you sort of build more of a relationship with it than some of your other watches you might. We always talk about, if there's dings and scratches, it builds character. It shows that it's being used. Well, that's what the patina is on a bronze watch, and it gives an opportunity for a deeper connection with a particular watch. Also keep in mind that not all bronze is created equal. There are different alloy combinations out there, and if you're wanting to try bronze but you don't necessarily like the notion of patina, try something like a Rado. They use an aluminum-based alloy so that it doesn't significantly patina, if really looking like it at all over time, versus a tin-based bronze where you're going to get more of a patina and age, rustic look over time, and maybe even a few hints of green. So just remember that. It's not all created equal, and so different brands pay attention to the type of bronze and what metals are being mixed with it. That significantly impacts the type of patina, if any, you might get on that bronze case. Now, Christopher Ward as a company, I think, has really committed to the notion of bronze. They've made multiple releases. They have offered some of, I think, the best bronze designs on the market to date. It kind of started with the Mark II Trident case. There was a solid blue dial C60 bronze. There was a limited edition GMT model. I have one of those. I've shown it a little bit, in wrist checks and stuff like that. Love the watch, that lighter blue color hand against that darker blue dial. It's a good combination. It's a great GMT watch. Now, personally, I was never quite sold on having the entire bezel being solid bronze. I like a little bit more contrast. And so the C60, Mark II never really greatly appealed to me, but I did like the GMT version and having the 24-hour track on the bezel. So eventually I got that, and I'm glad I have it. And as that patinas, sometimes those numerals have a little bit more of a shine than the blasted bezel part underneath, and so it does give a certain amount of contrast. So there is that. Now, when CW updated the case design to the Mark III, they also released a bronze model that has a distress dial. So it's kind of like a combination of what was going on with the hand distressing of the Ombré and then the blue dial of the original Mark II, kind of more casual, dressed down look, which is what you would have with a bronze typically. It looks good, and there have also been some other special editions. There's a bronze SH21, which of course is their in-house caliber. It's a beautiful watch. I personally like it better in stainless steel than the bronze, but it's also another option that's out there. The point is that CW has sort of committed to bronze in a long-term way, and they are offering some of the best ones on the market. And there are other companies that have started going down bronze, but as I think back through these releases that started, CW was really one of the few companies putting some bronze out there early on, and other companies, and particularly micro brands, have started to build on and copy that notion. Even though you have other really good brands like Helios, Zelos, again up to the Tudors, releasing bronze watches, my opinion is that the best bronze design that has been put on the market in the watch world is the Christopher Ward C60 Bronze Ombre. As always, use the comments below to discuss, agree, disagree, just stay polite. If you want to go bronze, I say, then go bronze. You want something that has that aged patina look. So that distress dial, the transition from light to dark with the ombre, the contrast of the bezel insert with that aged bronze on the outside. You get little hints of green darkness or brightness depending on where you're touching the crown and the bezel and the lugs. It is just a beautiful combination of what bronze and use of a watch is really all about. And then you have hands and markers that are able to capture almost any particles of light within a space. And the overall effect is just wonderful. And yes, there are quite a few bronze watches out there now. This is still the one. I don't know that I could have been convinced to try bronze unless I saw the design of this one. This is the one that's like, for some reason, I was anti-bronze almost. And then I saw this one on the page, I was like, I have to have that watch. Like, it was an impulse buy. It was like, I didn't even plan on it. It was just, that's beautiful. I'm going to try it. And that ended up being my foray into bronze, and I'm so glad it happened. The problem is now, they released another version. Do I keep them both? Do I keep one? If I keep one, which one do I get rid of? I recommend grabbing a drink and a snack. We're going to be talking about every detail from the brushed versus polished Trident hand to the caseback height. All right, it's really a pleasure to be able to be looking at both of these watches, sharing them with you, and doing a deep compare and contrast between their pros and cons and what I kind of like better and generally in terms of one design versus the other. And it's typically the case with me, I'll probably find it hard to keep my commentary economical, but I will do my best to distill the conversation down as we discuss the different aspects of the bronze ombre watches from Christopher Ward. Now, I'm going to say, on first glance, if you were looking on a website or whatever, or just passing by visually, you're going to say, hey, that looks like basically the same watch. But when you get up close, there are significant differences between these two iterations of the Christopher Ward C60 Bronze Ombre. But hey, you know what? At least you can see important differences from one model to the next, unlike Rolex. Haha, don't get in a fluff about it. You know it's true. One other thing I've done to help keep the playing field a little bit more even here is I've got them both on the CW hybrid strap. I really love this strap. It's extremely comfortable. If you haven't tried it, give it a try on an existing watch, or consider ordering it on a new one or along with it as an extra. It's beautifully done. Nice and solid canvas here on top, integrated with the rubber, and on the back it's extremely breathable. Just a great strap, quick release. I'll say something here in a little bit about the distressed leather straps that come with these ombre watches. In order to compare these two, we're going to have to mix both dimension and design together a little bit. So I'm not going to just be able to split out and say, let's talk dimensions and let's talk design. They're going to have to be discussed together. So let's talk about size and wearability a little bit first. The Mark II is advertised as a 43mm watch. The Mark III as a 42mm. Now, I take my calipers to the watches myself, and you're going to get a little bit of variation, maybe even a little bit from one to another, but it's going to be pretty close. Now, where I decided to measure these is right around the bezel, where you're going to see the largest dimension from the top, excluding the crown. And the Mark II is about 43.05 to about 43.10. So right there, just a little bit over 43mm diameter. The Mark III is right around 42.15, 42.20 in that range. So we generally have about a 1.1mm difference between the two. When you do look at these watches side by side from the top, kind of just looking straight down, and hopefully it translates here on video, the Mark III does look like a smaller diameter watch. I think what a lot of that has to do with, though, isn't so much the actual diameter of the watch, but the lug to lug. It's a little bit more of an elegant look about it, which is what we're going to see a lot of as we compare the two. But the lug to lug is the biggest difference in terms of the dimensions between these two. The lug to lug on the Mark II is 51.54, so 51.5 mil. The lug to lug on the Mark III is 49.28, So just a little over 49 mil. So we've got a 2.5 mil difference between the two when it comes to lug to lug. I've been wearing these around for the past 3 weeks. Yes, I've had this one for 3 weeks. I actually still have the sticker on here, but I've been trying to keep it in pristine condition to help get maybe some better pictures. It's really a deeply embossed case back between the polished and the blasted surfaces. So I'm going to keep this on just a little bit longer. I promise I'll take it off and I'll show you other pictures both here and in the blog post, but this is where you can see more of that diameter difference between the two. Again, it stands out a little bit more. Some of it has to do with the case design and look here on the case back, and just the smallest design choice can make a very big difference visually. So yeah, this looks a lot wider. Some of that is just the fact that this is all brushed, this has polished and beveled edges on it, and this one has larger notches for the case back tool to open up the case than we have on the Mark II. So just those couple little things make it look a lot smaller from the back. Now, personally, I think lug to lug is the most important dimension when it comes to wearability of a watch. 2 reasons. One, if you've got an optimal lug to lug, it just feels naturally like it wraps around the wrist a little bit better. But as you can see here from the back, it also makes the diameter look smaller. And that's not an issue with the case itself. The diameter is the diameter, but it makes it look smaller because of the reference that your eyes get from the edges. Now, building on top of that, here's the really interesting thing about the size and the wearability. This has got what CW calls their light catcher case, light catcher design. And that has to do with trying to make the edges look thinner. So one, we've got a shorter lug to lug, but they've got different design around here that the light will catch it certain ways. I think it looks better on the steel models, better than it does on the bronze. That's just me after wearing these two, again, in a more dedicated fashion over the past few weeks. But you can see it's got this cut out here, cut away, and it's a little bit more beveled here on the top edge. You can also see that I've only had this for about 3 weeks, but it's already started picking up some patina. It's not quite got as much of a rose gold sort of look to it. So the purpose here is to shrink this outer edge so that it looks less pronounced and just looks visually slimmer as it sits on the wrist. Okay, but again, let me show you something. This is kind of funny. I'm going to show you the Mark II and look at it from the side. Look top of crystal to highest point on case back. Okay. See that? Now keep this mentally in your mind for a moment. Set that there. Now look at the Mark III. Again, top of crystal, highest point on case back. Which one do you think is actually thicker? Which one has more height? Let me pop back here to the Mark II. Now it should be really clear. It's really clear to me visually. It's just like almost like stunning. Look at the two. Which one looks slimmer to you? Now the specs on the web for the Mark III say 13.4 millimeter height, and I had saved a copy of the page from the Mark II, and it said the same thing, 13.4. So they're marketed as being the same height. Well, with my calipers from top of crystal, usually the crystal height, the little bit that sticks over the edge, isn't included in case height measurements. So keep that in mind, why you might see discrepancy sometimes. But with my calipers measuring very top of crystal to highest point on case back, the Mark II is 13.7 millimeter. The Mark III, 13.9. And where you see some of that is really on the case back, which comes out a little bit more. So even though you have what looks like a visually thinner watch, the Mark II is actually thinner. And even more surprisingly, it still looks that way on the wrist. I've been wearing them both a lot, and the Mark III always looks taller on the wrist. The Mark II always has a little bit of a slimmer profile that just seems to sink a little deeper, and that's because the case back is not keeping it quite as high. Now you might say, 0.2 millimeter, does that really make that big of a difference? Well, to me, whenever I'm sitting on the couch, I'm lounging or whatever, and I'm looking at the watch from the side profile, it actually does stand out to be quite a bit different. And I'm going to show you what this looks like on the wrist. One of them has the design to make it look like it's slimmer. The other one is actually slimmer. And the one that is actually slimmer looks that way on the wrist. Now the Mark III will feel slimmer on the wrist for some people, I expect, somewhat due to the lug to lug, depending on your wrist size. I have about a 7.5-inch wrist, 19 centimeters. And for me, the Mark II actually looks and feels slimmer. Okay, so I've got this on the wrist now. And here up close, you can still see that the case back protrudes a little bit more. Like it's kind of raised, even though we've got this cutaway here, again, giving that sort of slimmer flowing profile. It's still sticking up a little bit high. So let me zoom out here. You can see the legs of my tripod and some junk on my desk. But I want you to get a sense of the height on this watch. All right. Now, keep that mental image. Let me flip over to the other one and look. That looks slimmer. I'm sorry. It's just the facts. That's because the case back stays hidden because it's slimmer. It doesn't feel like it's setting up as high because it's not. And it's not only physically a little slimmer, but that case back design makes a big difference. So really what you're contending with visually is, do you like the solid side profile or do you like this sort of cutout side profile? That light catcher design, as they like to call it at CW. Where the Mark III case design is really going to feel different is when it's on a bracelet, and that's not happening here on the bronze watches. So if these are both on the hybrid or they're both on leather, the Mark II is actually going to look and feel a little bit slimmer on the wrist. Again, this somewhat goes back to wrist size, don't forget that, but at least on my wrist, that's the case. I have a couple other Mark II watches, one of those being the stainless steel C60 Trident Pro. It's the ChristopherWard limited edition. On bracelet, that feels and looks a particular way. Where the Mark III is going to really stand out is if you have Mark III case design in stainless steel on, again, a Mark III bracelet design. That's going to feel very different, a little bit lighter, a little bit more ergonomic or aesthetically pleasing on the wrist than the Mark II. So some of this is related to the type of bracelet / strap. But on these bronze watches, I have to say that the Mark II wins out when it comes to wrist feel and presence and height, and it just looks and feels slimmer on the wrist. Then what you're contending with is which diameter looks better on your wrist, and they're only a mil apart, so they kind of look about the same from the top, just maybe a little bit visually smaller on the Mark III. But you know, on my wrist size, the Mark II is fine. 42 is more my sweet spot, I would say. Of course, weight's going to have an impact on how this feels on the wrist as well. My measuring, the Mark II is 128.37 grams. The Mark III, 120.06. So about 8 grams difference between the two. That's not bad, given the only difference is about a mil diameter on the Mark II. So when you wrap all of these dimensions together, the diameter, the lug to lug, the height, the weight, for me, the Mark II feels better on the wrist. And that actually came as a surprise to me. I was expecting the Mark III to have a better wrist feel about it. But, you know, both on the same strap, they're both extremely comfortable. I'm not saying the Mark III is a downgrade. You know, it feels great on the wrist. But for me, if I was picking between the two, on which feels better on the wrist, sort of just through the day wear, Mark II every time. Make them stainless steel, put them on bracelet, we're probably going to have a different story. Let's get into more of the design of the dials, hands, and all of that jazz. Let me put it this way. The Mark II looks a little bit like a tougher watch, whereas the Mark III looks a little bit more of an elegant design. Now, they both look rough and ready to go. They have this bronze ombre look about them. I think the advantage right now that my Mark II has is it has this beautiful patina that I haven't touched in 3 years about, that I've had the watch going on 3 years. And we've got the Mark III, still fairly new. It's lost a little bit of its brand new luster, which I like. I love patina. I love seeing it age in my own environment. But that gives it a little bit more of that still kind of elegant look right now. Now, once the Mark III has had a little bit more time, a couple years, and it's got a little bit more of a rustic and that patina look, age on it, it'll still have, I think, what I'll say is a blingy look about it due to the hands and the markers. There's something about the Mark II that makes me think, oh, I'm about to get into something. That's okay. The Mark III makes me think, maybe I should dress up a little bit more. You know, so that's the feel I get from, you know, these two whenever I'm thinking about which one to put on, and they're kind of side by side. This one's got the toughness, this one's got the bling. Now, the defining characteristic of these watches is the dial. Ombré, which is the transition of light to dark, vice versa. The Mark II was an LE of 300. I have number 10. You can see right there. And then the Mark III is an LE of 500. You can see this is number 8. You can notice, I would expect, even on the video right away, the ombre-ness about these is very different. It's very pronounced. It's the defining characteristic. When you look at the Mark II, boom, it is ombre. You see this brighter center and a fairly subtle but also elaborate transition to the black varnish on the sides. Look at the Mark III a little bit. It almost looks the same throughout. Now it does transition. It is certainly brighter in the middle and it gets darker as it goes out to an almost black edge, but it's certainly not to the extreme of the Mark II. Now it's going to be hard to get a really good picture of what these look like in the flesh, but that's always the case with watches. You see some picture, you see some video, and it's like, yeah, it looks okay. Always live pictures typically look better, and that doesn't even help whenever it comes to a watch like this, because what these look like in terms of the tones, whether that's talking about the case, the patina, the dials, the ombre-ness about these, looks completely different in life. I'm going to throw up a set of pictures. This is the Mark III, and this is in the same spot on my porch, and just moving the watch around, 3 different hits of light on it. Sometimes those distressed marks on the dial almost look non-existent. Sometimes they just pop out at you. Light makes a huge difference with these watches. Going to be dealing a little bit with reflection here as well, but you can see that the Mark II has a lot more of an extreme transition, a lot more of that underneath the dial, that brass, which is intended obviously to also look like bronze, is just a lot more prominent as you're towards center, and then as you hit the edge, it's completely black. And so that's one of the big differences, is the amount of ombre, we'll call it, is very different between these two. Yeah, it's there on the Mark III, you can see, but it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more of a singular color almost. It doesn't get dark until the very edge, so most of the interior looks about the same, to be honest. Now again, each one is unique in the hand distressing. You can see the marks there. You can see the bling, right? The hands and markers really stand out in a different way when comparing the two. Of course, on here, the markers don't have the metal surrounds. Hands still have a nice shine to them, obviously. But so yeah, the main thing about this is that it's ombre. Issue is the Mark III has less ombre, and it depends on what you look. Now I know why they did that. Look closely again. It's obvious why they did it. Look at the text. Look at the writing. Which one is more legible and stands out more? You can certainly see the name, christopherward there, that it's a chronometer. You got the depth rating, Swiss made. They've boxed the date on the Mark III. Actually, I like it just fine unboxed on the Mark II. Doesn't need it because it's light enough around the box, and then the date wheel is black. I can see why it would be more necessary on the Mark III, because it's going to be the overall looks a lot darker, but it would be a little bit harder to see that transition without having the date border. So some of the pros of the Mark III, yeah, the text is more legible. It has the border on the date window. Some people might like that, some people might not. Looks just fine without it on the Mark II. So you can still read the text fine on here, but there's plenty of light situations where the text is a little bit harder to read because the dial is light enough that it's not much of a contrast between the white and the shine that you're getting off of the dial and what's coming through the varnish. But on the Mark III, you can read it a lot better. So that's one of the big design differences. The ombre of the dial, it gives the text more prominence on the Mark III. So if you were going to choose between the two, it's which one do you like better, the darker look or the sort of real ombre where you get that full-on extreme transition? For me, Mark II.